Hey guys, Tempest here. Just a friendly Canadian reminder to keep force spying, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.
Right, this is going to be another episode of my Patreon AMA. Anyone who's in the $10 or higher tier can submit a question. I put a post on the Patreon website. I also now have a Discord server. You can find the link in the description box. There's a channel there where you can submit questions as well. So I've got a lot to do for this one. There was loads that people submitted last time. So I'm going to get through as many as I can in this one. And then in quick succession, the next few days, I'm going to do another one. Then we're going to be on to the next one, which once you've seen this, there'll be a thread. You can start submitting those already. So Winster, it's not really a proper name, says, during the years I have followed you, you generally use American sports more as metaphors, even though most Europeans use football. He means soccer there. What is the reasoning for that? As usual, like my patrons, they always try to answer the question for me. So he goes, after he asks this question like I'm somebody who's never done an interview, and they're like trying maybe here's some options you could have. It's like, mate, I've done a million interviews. I know how to answer any question. Don't you worry about me. But he says, is it your audience, more similarities? You just like them more, or something else? Or thanks for putting or something else. By the way, I'll just answer whatever I want, no matter what you put in that box there. You could put whatever either or you want. Anyway, you get the point. Right? Basically, I use the sports I'm following and I'm thinking about, because as I watch sports, this is something I learned over the years. It's actually how I became a more interesting content creator, is I went from being someone who was within esports and knew a little bit maybe about football, and then after spending a lot of time in esports, the way I laterally tried to think around topics and think of new angles on topics and bring new things into it is I took that old advice of like, you only can take away what you bring to the table. Or that defines what you'll take away rather. So I tried to look in other fields in the same way as if you've ever read that classic book I often recommend, The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin. A lot of it's about how looking at other areas allowed him to incorporate concepts into chess and how he thought about it. Or, taking concepts from chess, he could apply it to Tai Chi push hands or BJJ, if you know what happened to him after the book, etc. I think he's into like e-foiling now or some shit. So, the interesting thing for me is just my thought processes and what I'm working on, what I'm thinking of, and then what I'm relating back to esports. It's going to be related to the sports that I'm really into at that point in time and that I'm studying. And as usual, I'll study every sport in the same way I do with esports. So when I got into the NFL, for example, I won't say where you get the games, but I went and watched games going back 20 years. I went and got my favourite players that I was into and I studied their whole career. I watched all the big playoff games. I watched the big marquee matchups. I tried to look what the rule changes were between, what the lineups were, who they had. Like while I was watching the game, great thing about American football games, there's so much downtime. I would like Google the stats of different players and see like, is this guy overperforming here? Like, why does this guy only go off against this team? I'll try and figure stuff like that out. So basically, if you go way, way, way back in time, yeah, I'll have given some soccer, some football analogies. Obviously, basketball was a big one I was in because in the 2000s, I was putting a lot of my time into studying basketball, especially my downtime from esports. Hockey, another classic one that I often put a lot of comparisons into, but more old school. You notice I don't tend to do as many of the newer school ones because nowadays I just watch hockey a bit like I watch Dota. It's just a fun thing I watch on the side. I'm not really trying to study it as much, and I'm mainly just watching the playoffs and the big games. I'm not watching people's whole season, so I wouldn't be that great at like ranking players or positions and stuff like that now. And the interesting thing is, obviously, I got into the NFL the last few years and I went pretty hard at it. So I just basically do it based on what I'm into. Now, crucially, I don't pick obscure sports like snooker that I know 99% of people are going to have no reference point to whatsoever. Because even if I reference that, it's just such a difficult learning curve sport and such a slow-paced sport. I don't think, not even if I told you someone's like the J-Dong of that or the cooler of snooker, most of you aren't ever going to go and watch it. So it won't actually help you much to know much about that. So it also helps that, as I knew a long, long time ago from the Google Analytics, the majority of my viewers are from the United States of America. So as a result, there's a nice overlap when I talk about those elements. Also, when I used to have a lot of friends online that I talked to in my downtime, not as much a thing nowadays in esports, just have way better ways to communicate. I used to, obviously, they have no interest in European sports, so talking to them about the NBA or the NHL, whatever sports I was into, was the overlap, and then we could make the comparisons. Because I've always thought analogies, I obviously did that video about LS. I think they're a brilliant way to draw people in, interest people, and then transfer concepts from game to game without having to re-explain the whole premise again. Like when I did that explanation about how creating space for someone in Counter-Strike is like creating a pocket for them. I even have a similar concept I'll probably do a video on soon where I actually think that the way that the AD carry in a classic team fight, admittedly they don't exist as much anymore because the top lane and mid pool, when you had those ones, it was about protecting and peeling for him. That reminds me of when a player who's a quarterback in the NFL has to stay in the pocket, and he can't just be like a noob would think, looking at all the guys coming at me. He has to just trust that that blocker gets to that guy, and that Errol Donald isn't coming at his head like that 1,000 miles an hour, because otherwise he's going to have time. He only gets like 2 seconds to throw the ball. He has to be reading his routes and then his options, and then throw the ball where he's going to. So I think that's an interesting concept, because the players I see, Doublelift I think suffered from this in some of his bad teams, where they get paranoid and they can't trust their teammates. They're not as effective. The reason why some of the AD carry who are from Asia are god tier is exactly because they've got the freedom to just look for their targets and gauge that, while the others, it's their job to peel the guys off them. So anyway, little preview there. The NA kerfuffle says, so here's the thing, Thorin. One of the common talking points on your talk shows for League has been practice environment. I always found NA mimicking the Korean mentality quite baffling. It feels like the Korean culture plays a part of why that even works in the first place. Even then, most people lose productivity the more hours you put into a task. So my question is the following. Do you think NA should practice less and focus more on fundamentals, since practicing does not improve their comprehension of the game more? Yeah, effectively, because I actually don't think it makes almost any sense to make NA players practice like Koreans do, because there's just no overlap whatsoever in terms of the culture, how they think about the game, how they actually systematize games. Funnily enough, Koreans in that sense are a lot more like a classical chess player, where you break down the basic concepts of the positions, the openings, how an end game works. You're following like a basic script, and you're trying to do the most correct moves at all point in time, which I actually, by the way, don't even think actually works as well in the last couple of years of League of Legends. I think it's actually something that cost a lot of the Korean players, and I think it's one of the reasons most of those teams are as good. That's why a team like Gen G would be a fabulous team if this was like 4 years ago. In the modern meta though, you know what, there's a bunch of teams I could actually see either winning games off them from the West, I mean TSM almost fucking beat them, or beating them in a series potentially. So actually, the interesting thing for me is, to me, trying to make NA players train like Koreans is like trying to make a goat learn to be like a horse. It doesn't have any of the same characteristics, any of the qualities. I think you'll actually make it a worse goat in doing so. And you certainly won't make it anything approaching a horse, and it'll never beat a horse in the areas that a horse is strong. You should try and tailor it to those players. Like, I've always thought the LPL makes a lot more sense to copy if you're NA. It's a lot more about team fights. It's a lot more about fighting all the time, which I think you should encourage NA players to do. It's not about perfect, clean macros. It's not about side laning and stuff as much. Like, I've always thought that was the obvious parallel, but people were just too ignorant to actually watch the LPL. I personally think that what teams should do, I would say this for Counter-Strike teams as well from all regions. I think teams should start putting between 1.5 and 2 times as much of their practice into theory, and some of the theory should be personal research and practice. As in, one player goes away, watches pro views of a player who plays his position who you suggest has a style he could take something from, or goes and watches the enemy, but only from how he's going to play. And then you have the group ones where you go over the games and you show them concepts, because the more time you get getting a concept across and using examples, and then the practice is implementing that, I think that's way better than just playing scrims over and over and over again. I think all scrims do in that sense is just maybe like test form, try out like comfort on picks. Like, I don't think they actually accomplish as much as people think. So to me, it's one area that you can control is the theory that you do. I actually think the missing area for NA teams is, I would take all that money and I would invest in the best coaching staffs in the world. As in, I would even go like, I'd have coaching staffs of like 6 people, and I'd divide up tasks, and I'd have an overall guy whose vision directs it all. Like, I'd make that where you put the money, because Koreans aren't making any attempt to do that. Europe, they've just got amazing players and they just need like the minimum amount of touches at the moment. In LPL, they tend to also not listen to the coaches as much. So I actually think, for me, that's where NA could actually have an edge. I also think they should use loads of boot camps. Every time your teams aren't playing in LCS, in my opinion, you should go and do a boot camp. That might only be a week boot camp, but it's going to level your shit up. I even had the idea, I was thinking about it the other day as well. I know it's going to make your solo queue ping worse, but everyone complains that that's the thing that gives you the least actual like efficient practice anyway in NA. Why don't people consider what TSM did back in the day, where you go to the East Coast and you get a team house there so that your ping is like vaguely playable to Europe? So let's say if you're on the very East Coast of America and the server, I think the servers in Europe are in Amsterdam, if you were to play on a server there, and in a world of like an FPL type thing where they could have different servers, you could even have one in the UK and have it even better, you could actually potentially get 90 to 100 ping. Now, that ain't going to be great practice, but I'd rather practice like that against some decent European teams than just play a bunch of the bottom LCS teams if that's my other practice. So I think something to consider. The point is to think laterally around the problem, as you kind of try to do here, but I don't think many in NA do, quite frankly. Hands on keyboard. Who, in your opinion, were some of esports' biggest overachievers? People whose skills and playstyle would be indicative to a certain level or form of consistency, but instead won much more despite these facts. See, the funny thing about that is you're actually going to get a lot of people who still are some of the greatest champions in esports. And so you might think that might be cheating because their playing style obviously proved massively effective. But what I mean by that is I'm actually trying to take it in the spirit of the question. Like, the skills of these people suggested they never should have been champions, even domestically in regions. And I think more importantly than that, the style they have isn't the one actually you'd pick to be the best or be the dominant one or win championships. So I'll start in Quake Live, and I've got to take Rafa. Like, I think Rafa's skills to do what he did in a game where the other great players tend to have among the best skills with different guns is fucking unbelievable. Like, I still to this day, I personally I've never really done like a hardcore comparison now that Quake Live careers are ended. I personally have like Cypher as my Quake Live GOAT, but I don't hate it if someone has Rafa. I think they're the clear 1A, 1B within that conversation. And the idea that Rafa can even be in that conversation shows how insanely this guy overachieved. Like, I think it would be more appropriate if he'd have had a career akin to Dahang's, where you're a good player, you can upset a lot of the big players, probably a couple of them you can't beat, like he wasn't that good at beating Cypher, for example, in terms of Dahang we're talking about here. And you just have a lot of seconds, a lot of top fours. I mean, Dahang, to be fair, was probably due at least one championship, but it just never happened for him. I mean, the idea, for example, that someone with the skills of Evil and an aggressive playing style never ever won a big championship, but Rafa won loads. I mean, I know the time frames aren't lined up, that Evil didn't have as many shots at the big lands, but that is bonkers. Like, you would never predict that if you looked at their skill set and you were judging before the game began. In Counter-Strike, I've got to go with Get Right. Like, Get Right started out in the early days of 1.6 trying to just be what everyone was, like the next Zet or Forest, like trying to be an aggressive player, rushes in, like sprays, like just use your aim to defeat people, your skills. But then eventually, by learning, especially once he got to SK and mastering this lurking style, being the Grims as it were, but becoming the best ever to do it in the history of Counter-Strike, the way he dominated the end of 1.6 and early CSGO is fucking insane to me. Like, I don't think anyone's ever played that style and be that dominant. Like, the closest comparison is later when Cold Zero came along, and Cold Zero didn't have quite the skill level of Get Right. So, like, if you look at Get Right's skills, yeah, he should have been one of the best, but he also could easily have just been lost in the pack of the many Swedes. It's the reason why those semi-pro 1.6 movies from Swedes were straight fire, because they all just tried to be the next Forrest and just play off their fucking aim and get the most crazy highlight clips. Get Right mastered a style that typically, that's more usually, in an ideal team, normally you want your lurker to be like your second or third best player typically. It's hard to build around that and have championships. That's why I have so much respect for Get Right, for Cold Zero, even to some degree for Happy when he was at his peak. Then I'm going to have to go into the StarCraft world, and from StarCraft 2, I'll take MMA. If people don't know, the way this guy played, and the way he would use like a harass style, if you saw how slow this guy moved his fucking mouse in his APM, it was bonkers. Like, I got to actually spend time around him because I was one of the people who helped recruit him to Team Acer when you could bring over the Europeans and playing WCS, the Koreans and playing WCS. So I spent a lot of time around this guy. It was just the guy's mind and his vision and his work ethic. He also had a great confidence in the game where he thought he should be able to beat MVP and stuff that he never should have had a chance to beat. So again, the idea you're going to play a game that APM can have a massive effect upon, not as much as StarCraft 2's Brood War, obviously. Again, what a fucking boss. This guy was able to become a many-time champion, resurrect his career a couple of years later. What a boss. Similarly in StarCraft, I think one of the most insane ones ever, one of the best examples ever of brain and read on the meta making you a champion and arguably the best in the world at one point in time. It's got to be Nesty, the Zerg player, who dominated like early StarCraft 2 in terms of the Zerg players. When the other Zergs, it was like Fruit Dealer fluke in that first one with the ridiculous like gambles. Like, Nesty was a fucking chess master. Now his problem was he couldn't adapt to the later world of the DRGs and stuff where you had to be like the super macro Zerg. Like, that wasn't his game. And so, yeah, he fell off as he should have done. But the fact that he had those championships early, what a fucking beast. He had a couple of tournaments there. I think he had one where he never lost a single game. That's fucking disgusting. You're playing against some people who had really good micro and skills, the MVPs of the world. And I think you saw when he played MVP, because he was his teammate and he knew the way he thought about the game. There's a reason MVP beat him pretty much every time. In League of Legends, it's harder to pick people because commonly, like, mechanics aren't as big a deal, I don't think, in League of Legends. So I'll pick a couple that weren't at the top level. But I've always had great respect for Paul Belter's game. I've always thought the number of championships and the number of times he's been in finals and being in teams that could go to Worlds, that's way above, in my opinion, the raw skills. Like, if we want to talk raw skill level, I think people like Shifter, Link, there's a load of them, Zhao, there's plenty of pretty good mid laners that have played in the LCS, Featherven, that have accomplished far less in the LCS, obviously, than Paul Belter. So, I mean, what a boss, right? Just knew how to do his job. That's the key thing. In my opinion, you want Paul Belter to be your third best laner. If he is, now we're cooking with gas. Now you can do something. I'd even maybe throw in Huhi from that 2016 CL, because I thought he was actually skill-wise a dreadful player. I thought his champion pool was garbage. But he just stayed in his lane and he let other people do their shit and he just did his own unique style. So I think there's some pretty good picks. Vigar says, "Hey Thorin, I have recently tried to learn more about what makes a good support player in CS. I was wondering how you would rank the top 5 most essential support players and what qualities that make each of them so important for their respective teams." Right, so I'm assuming you mean right now, and so these are people you can go and study. So I'm going to pick these people out, and I will say, I actually get the sense that one of these guys might actually not be playing the supportive role anymore, so maybe you have to go a couple of years back, but I'll give you the picks for that. So when I just quickly bash together a list of 5, the number 1 is, of course, Xyp9x. Like, probably has the best decision-making and clutches of any player to ever play Counter-Strike. Like, I mean, the only people who compare to him are, like, the superstar clutch round players, like Nico, Shox, old school Get Right. Like, the idea Xyp9x does that with, in my opinion, slightly lesser skills and with, like, none of the focal point in the same team is really insane. Like, Xyp9x is one of the few players where he can lose a clutch, and I still think, he played that correctly, actually. Like, you know, that was just a case where, you know, the odds were on his side and he didn't win it, or the other guy hit a nice shot. I also think another thing to watch for, which is a classic support aspect that a lot of fans don't understand, is it's that you just don't give your life up easily. Because if people are going to gamble away from you, and that's why you're supportive, or your job is to draw fire, like, basically, he knows how to just waste the T's time when he's on CT side. On T side, he knows how to sort of take over areas without having to do crazy peaks. Like, this is a guy who really understands the premise of when I can't die now on CT side, because then they just rotate onto my site and take the site completely. Like, I have to stay alive. I have to still have presence. I can't just hide the whole time. Like, he really understands that very, very well. And that's a mad underrated quality to have in a team. You win a lot of games if you can do that. It's actually a thing that Marklov used to be very underrated for when he was in Flipside. One that'll probably shock you, I'm going to say Tizian. I actually think Tizian is mad underrated because people only look at his skills. And actually, funnily enough, every now and then he has those bullshit Deagle clips. But his raw skills, he's not in the positions, he's not in the situations where they're ever going to be a big fragger. So his numbers are never going to be great. But this guy is a really shrewd, smart player. And as I referenced, he has better aim than you'd expect. You put him in some tough corners, he could shoot his way out. And just the shit, I mean, you first saw it when he started practicing that weird box thing on Dust 2 where he would just peek over and shoot you instantly from behind it. Like, stuff like that. You can tell this guy's putting in extra time to find different angles, different ways to play his spots. And sometimes they're some of the hardest spots in the game to play. I'm going to take, even though this is more on the supportive end, I'm not sure he's a support player, I'm going to take RPK from Vitality. He's not at all afraid. Like, he doesn't seem to get it because he used to be a god in Source, that he's nowhere close to that skill-wise now. He still absolutely is willing to run through a brick wall, stand in a net choke where a bunch of people are going to shoot him. He'll do whatever it takes. So to me, what he is able to show you is being sacrificial and taking on the shit roles. If you don't have to be good at them, you just have to be able to manage it, and that can make another player on your team way better. So the idea is the kills of a Tizian or an RPK show up on someone else's part of the scoreboard, not his. The one that I referred to, I'm not sure he actually plays support now. I haven't watched enough of his games in Godsend, but he definitely was in Mavsports. It's got to be Sticko. Like, this guy had really good comms. It's the famous thing that they said after he got kicked out of the team for snacks. He has pretty good skill. He actually had underrated skill. It's one of the reasons why I think now he probably doesn't play those styles as much. It seems like he's much better in Godsent. And a guy who's ultimate sacrifice. Like, he used to just play to set Oscar up and get Oscar rolling. Because you know if you get Oscar rolling on an AWP, yeah, it could be game over. You could win it right there. Last guy I'm going to pick is another underrated one because he was even kicked out of his own team. They didn't get what he did. It's got to be X7 from Ents. When I look at the classic Ents, I know everyone used to go wild about Alu. I think Alu's a good player. I think most of his career he's been above average AWPer. He's never been close to the best AWPer for my money. So I have to say, when I look at that team, I actually think the order of importance in that team, and I've got some hindsight now, goes like this. Sergey, but only in the context that he has Alexi B. Because without Alexi B, he just doesn't seem to have the decision making and doesn't understand how to utilize himself. So Sergey was the star player. Then you had Alexi B. He set up the tactics and made the calls, as far as I can tell, that made them that fantastic T-side team. Then I'd go X7 because of how he shored up the rest of the team. Then I'd go Alu, and finally I'm Ariel. Now, why they were obsessed with Ariel for the whole time, aside from that Blast Madrid MVP in the Augma, I don't know. Finnish players, I've made my rants about them before on those shows with Lurpis. I don't think they understand the game in the same way the others do, and they will, if left to their own devices, especially without an IGL, just stack skill over and over and over again and play very basic Counter-Strike. So, I've got to say, I think X7 was a very clutch player, way more clutch than you expect if you just watched his crosshair on like a POV. Seemed to be unfazed by big moments. He's basically one of the main reasons. He was the X factor that got them over the line against Team Liquid and Na'Vi and stuff, got them to that major final. Like, the others did a great job in their roles, but he was like a weird element you could never have predicted. Right, Malcolm says, "Hey Thorin, I like hearing your thoughts on MMA. Great Gastelum PoE comparison. And was wondering what your this is actually one where the question's too old, but I'll answer it anyway because I'll give you basically some thoughts and you'll just see, like, and actually, you have to believe me, but I actually would have definitely predicted this one correctly. He wanted to know what my thoughts were on the Costa versus Adesanya fight. And he said, people turned on Izzy after the Romero fight, but I still think he's head and shoulders above everyone else. Right, first thing to say, people in MMA are the most feckless entirely. I didn't say fans there, because even analysts just turn so hard on someone when they have a decisive loss or an underwhelming fight that they act like every fight plays out the same and that matchups play out the same and people's mental state's the same and people aren't injured in training camps and stuff and you have to hide the shit. So the thing that kills me is that Adesanya-Romero fight, everyone went ham on Adesanya. But what they don't seem to realise is, listen, both of them had very weird strategy in that fight. But here's what I want you to consider. You can think whatever you want about your Romero. I tell you what, your Romero is one of the most dangerous people you can fight. Because if he fucking cracks you, anyone is going out. Like, I don't care who you are. You could be prime Anderson Silva. If he get you on the chin, I think your Romero could have knocked him out if he properly caught him flush. So, Adesanya was very cognizant of that. And unfortunately, I think that's why it was a rubbish fight. It's why sometimes striker versus striker isn't the matchup you want. So, I think Adesanya is fucking unbelievable. Like, I even like some of the comparisons to old school Anderson Silva. I think they're a little bit stretched at the moment. He's far from doing what that guy did, but the talent level's certainly there. So to me, I already would have said it had to be Adesanya. Like, Costa had a chance, but for me, I mean, the last thing you want to do is be a striker against Adesanya. He's a monster counter striker. And there's another problem, right? It's like when famously, I think it was Leites versus Anderson Silva. It was one of the shittest fights ever. Because Leites knew Anderson Silva's the best counter-striker ever, so I'm not going first. So all you do is you do what's called trying to go third, which is you have all those feints and you back and forth, but you're just doing that. And to you, you're going, bloody throw. Because those feints is what you see when the punch is coming. That's all you get to see if you're the other guy. So when you see that, you think he is going to throw it. So everything's like, you're trying to basically dodge imaginary knockouts that could happen. So that's why it can be a stalemate effectively. So I would say Adesanya is way too talented, way too dangerous. There was a puncher's chance for Costa, but I think you had to get him early, and I think you really had to make him try and gas himself, and I just never saw that happening personally. So Adesanya is the guy to watch in that division. Like, he could do fucking anything he wants to. VatriSam, how much have you followed football? UK, not the bullshit American version, and how much do you follow it these days? Right, not at all. Like, every now and then, just for social reasons, I would sometimes watch a European football game. But I think American football, it's amazing I'm saying this because I wouldn't have thought this years and years earlier. But guess what? When I was younger, I had certain things I was ignorant about and never bothered to think about my preconceived notions. And people have like, they attach their identity, like, this is cool, therefore I represent. They're like, people just do that shit when you're young. Because what happens is when you're young, you don't know who you are. And sadly, you think that you're just trying to pick from a menu because that's what society tells you. You don't realize you're supposed to look internally and then also decide things you want to build up about yourself. So for me, American football is a far superior sport to European soccer. Don't fight it. If you don't think it, I don't give a fuck. Go live your life. Be happy. Watch those shit 90-minute games that are 0-0 draws where you go, brilliant possession, the whole game. I don't give a fuck, mate. Go enjoy your own life. Like, if you want to deprogram yourself, I think you could get a lot from the NFL. I will say, they've sort of powdered... They basically watered the fucking NFL down like the NBA, where they've made the offensive rules way too OP. So ignore them bragging about the stats, but just enjoy the game, basically. Sadly, you'll never get to enjoy the really sick, like, early 2000s and 90s defenses. I mean, kind of as I alluded to before, the best reason, in my opinion, to follow soccer is actually to have a relationship, if you're European, with your male family and friends. Like, we don't have very many things that can just be a natural bond that you can go and do with those people and still have fun with them, share classic memories with them, have things you can talk about with them. I actually think that European soccer can play a very big role in that respect. So if you're someone who's super into esports or fucking K-pop or anime or some shit, don't go and talk to your dad or your male friends about that shit if they're not into it. Find something like that is a shared ground. Maybe you can get them into MMA or boxing or something. You can talk about that. It plays a very important role, in my opinion, in society. Like, if you don't have strong families, society is going to be absolute shit. And at that point in time, you can complain about all the other things in the world, but you should have taken care of your family, and your family should be taking care of you. So I would say that's the reason to follow it if you're in Europe on some level. I will just throw in, I was a Liverpool fan when I was a boy, particularly the era with Fowler, McManaman, Redknapp, these players, then Steven Gerrard. So it is surreal to me that they finally won the Premier League, especially because they blew it that few years earlier. So yeah, there's still something interesting to watch. I also sometimes, I definitely watch highlight compilations of Messi and Ronaldo and those guys. And sometimes I'll look at their careers from a historical angle, but I'm not that interested in following a load of games. I think it's a mad overrated sport. Dolly says, as a teacher, one of my favourite learning theories of the modern day is that of mastery, where the fundamentals of a concept are repeated and practiced in different contexts to form a fundamental base of knowledge that is adaptable, in short, not running before you can walk. Are there any CS players who you think possess this quality of mastering the fundamentals, or any that haven't? The haven't one's going to be difficult, so maybe we'll get to that in a minute, right? In terms of like mastering the fundamentals, the key thing I actually think about Counter-Strike, that a lot of people don't understand, is to orchestrate the game like Zonic and Glaive do. First of all, I think you can only do if you have some of the very, very unique pieces like Device and Zipnix that they have in their team. I think if you give them A-Core and... who would the other example be for that? Shush or something, I don't think they'll be able to do those things. So that is fantastic, but it's like an orchestra. Everyone has to be playing their thing at the right time, with the right cue, with the right vibe together. The best way to play all sports is to master certain fundamental concepts and repeat them over and over again when they work. So famously, like Peyton Manning used to just throw the fucking, the dig route over and over and over and over again. He had like 2 or 3 basic things that he was looking for when he came out in his post-snap read, his pre-snap rather, and then he would go and he would call and he would throw that. And even though he was one of the best quarterbacks ever, he wasn't trying to do like, look at all my tactics and all my fucking play, but no, he was just trying to do things that were effective and get the ball down the field, move the chains. So similarly, Stockton and Malone in basketball with the pick and roll, that just works. Like, that's very rarely ever not going to work. And if it doesn't, you have the shooters around them, so then you have somebody kick it out too. So for me, the masters of the game are the ones who understood some fundamental concept that they could implement and just iterate over and over again. So when Fallen in 2016, 2017 was an IGL, the way they were able to play those post-plant and late-round scenarios was very, very clean. They understood man advantage, which they even had from the days before he got called Zera. They understood concepts like let people... Basically, as a 2 or 3 man unit, they do what Astralis does. Like, here's how we just lurk the whole map. Here's how we make them rotate into us and make a mistake. Here's how we make them think that they have to go for an aggressive play, but then we use the time, position, clock it, everything against them. Like, I thought that was very good. Sadly, he couldn't update his formula. His formula became kind of stale for him, at least. I think Carrigan with his mid-round aspect, because what people don't get is he has a few bases And he wants to do it basically like Federer's serve. He wants them all to look the same at the beginning, so you can't guess where he's going. And then he's free to just make a mid-round call that can change up which ending of the strat. How do we go from here at this point in time? Or what's a timing window I can hit? It's more like StarCraft a little bit, if you know the great timing attack players. And crucially, one of the reasons he's going to do these mid-round calls is he's going to set up some of his stars to be in really favourable positions where they're going to win out their duels, they're going to win out their situations, they're going to have a gun advantage, and they're going to take over that site. And then he lets his players take it over from there. So if you want to talk about players, those are IGLs. Device is an obvious example. This guy wasn't even a primary AWPer. He used to be like a hybrid AWPer who'd just use it if he was feeling it. But the way he mastered the AWP, he's not the best AWPer ever, but he's one of the only people I think who's ever truly mastered the AWP. Like, I don't even think someone like Simple can AWP the way that Device can. Might be a better killer with the AWP than Device, debatable. But I think the way Device has mastered that weapon and his ranges and his understanding when to rotate off and how to take fights and where his opponents will be, beyond comparison. Nico's an obvious example, individually. I mean, if people don't get it by now, this is something we've all been saying since 2016. Just go watch this guy play a T-side on a map that's quite open. Could be Mirage, Cache, Dust 2. Just watch the way he takes angles, the way he peeks a corner, the way he moves. He never seems to go very, very fast, but he's always moving at the perfect pace to get the right fights, to know where the guy's going to be, to not get flanked. Remember, this guy has a super low sensitivity, so he has to just know where you are. Like, I think he is unbelievable in that sense. Cold Zero is a classic example, right? Cold Zero was like a secondary IGL and had to understand all the map rotations and everything, because that's what allowed him to make his style the most effective and understand what his team's going to do. Got to give it up to him. Shock's another classic one. Old school Get Right, where he basically built a whole new style of lurking. Before that, you were baiting a bit, or you were just a guy at the end of the round watching the flank or something. The way he really turned lurking into a pressure game, into a way to completely shift the dynamic around, to actually get the most kills, to draw people's attention from you. There's a lot of genius in what he was doing. He's the sort of person where in the future I hope I can do documentaries and go back and break down some of the things that they were trying to do. EliGE, I know from talking to him, this is a guy who's very cerebral about the game. Put a lot of time in how he plays it. If you read that article I wrote, I basically go in depth about how he just knows his ranges. He knows where to take his fights. He knows now how to perform up to his level, even when he's playing the best teams and his teams are losing. So I think that's right up there. Rops is another obvious example. Just look at the way year on year he's gotten better and better and better. And it ain't just skills. Like, the skills were already very good. But the way his mind for the game has leveled up from an FPL player to a really sick, like, thinking man's player. And a guy that you'd want, like, he'd be one of your first picks if you were making a team tomorrow. I think if you want to pick people who have a chance to go to that direction, I think Shush from Mad Lions showed some flair. I mean, that was just at Flashpoint 1. I think Breeze from Evil Geniuses has shown some of those qualities. I thought he was on fire that autumn of 2019. So some of these players could join that category one day if they learn some of the mental aspects, I think. I can't actually see who this question's from, so I'm just going to read it out anyway. It says, "Hi, Thorin. I'm probably..." No, fuck all that shit. It just basically says, "Have you ever played World of Warcraft? And if so, to what extent? Also, how much potential do you think this had as an esport? Clearly now, viewer numbers are very low, and I think it's a missed opportunity by Blizzard, but I remember many years ago, the viewership numbers were very high on MLG. Blah, blah, blah. Nowadays, the world..." Ultimately, I don't follow it at all. I don't care at all about MMORPGs. The only one that ever interested me at all was Ultima Online, and I heard even then they nerfed the shit out of that and stopped all the PvP and stuff. So I think those games are incredibly boring. I have no interest in them whatsoever. Nothing appeals to me about them. And the fact that they're a time sink and seem to ruin people's lives doesn't make me really particularly want to get into them either. So in my opinion, they're too hardcore. I don't think they'll ever be massive viewing sports. I think they can only be if you have tens of millions of people play the game and you somehow convince them to watch the actual match, which as far as I know was based on things like embedding the stream. So I was told by some of the best players ever in World of Warcraft like 10 years ago, like, if you were even like slightly below our level, if you were just like 90% as good as us, you wouldn't even understand what we're doing and why we're doing these spell combinations and what we're trying to uniquely do with this like comp here, etc. So I was like, right, well, cool, I'm out. So for me, it's something like snooker or archery or something where you've got to just be like balls deep embedded in the sport. And they're just going to be fringe sports. They're never going to be the biggest sport in the way that like soccer is or whatever, or MMA. Jerky's Minion, my boy. The current world's draw. Let me see. Current Worlds draw seems very weird and just completely wrong for certain teams. What would be a good solution to this instead of the random draws they keep doing? Right, that is a very good question. I think it actually deserves its own video. So I potentially could do one. Essentially, I know I've done videos on this topic before, but I've done so many, it's hard to remember what the names of the videos are, unfortunately. So if anyone can tell it, just put it in the description, in the comment section if you actually know the video I'm referring to. Basically, the main problem is the pool system, which they've slightly improved by making 4 pools, does ultra fuck you. Because it'll always treat it as though, like, there'll always be some team who's from, like, PCS who gets the same equivalent seeding, essentially, as, like, the third best LPL or fucking LCK team, which is utterly inane. Similarly, the NA team will always have the same ranking as the number 1 LPL, number 1 LCK. That already is going to ruin it. Then that whole thing that you can't be from the same region, that just makes some garbage as well. And so, in my opinion, when we're judging who got out of the group and who had the chance, half the time they're not even competing in vaguely similar scenarios. Where if you actually seeded properly, I know that sounds like a complicated topic because there's no perfect solution, but this is a fucking way worse solution. I don't think that basically the current system can ever produce good groups. So I think this is one of the worst systems possible. As I say, that's probably a topic for a different video in terms of how I would fix it, I guess. Peyton Lee Trahan says, what caused EliGE to go from a good player in 2017 to 2018 to one of the best players in the world in 2019? Right, I would say it's primarily mentality. Like, if you read my article, which I will link in the description box below, assuming I remember, you'll see a lot of what I'm talking about in there, how he had to overcome these demons in his mind and his own conceptions of what a star is and how much you should communicate and what it's like to be a good teammate. I'll also say, you know what, I try not to take credit for these things because I don't actually believe that anyone else can change anyone else. But I do think you can be the finger pointing at the moon, and if they know not to look at the finger, which is what bragging about it yourself would be, and instead look at the moon, then they can gain some kind of insight, can't they? So, in my opinion, I think I had a little bit to do with it. I think I nudged him the right way. I've certainly had some chats with him, some private conversations, suggested some material for him to look into. And yeah, I generally leave that for players to talk to about. I notice no one ever asks him in interviews, so either the interviewers are shit or they're just not interested in that topic. Maybe they don't give me shine. Who the fuck knows? But all I'll say is there's an interview with Nanawa coming out soon, Reflections, which if you just watch that, you might get a sense of what I'm talking about, put it that way. I maybe even drop a little hint for you. I mean, all I'll say is this. My track record of the people I have nudged and given this stuff to is insane. Like, if I showed you before I nudged them what they were doing and afterwards who they are, you know what? Maybe when I retire, I'll give you the list if I feel like it's enough years have passed and it's fine to do it. Because certainly I was never sworn to secrecy or anything. Justin Reed says, what would you include in a museum exhibit on esports? Right, so I'm taking this to kind of be like where in those Hall of Fames in America, they have like some classic like item that everyone loved. Like, you know, I mean, I'm going to be making one of what I are say, but if some famous player had always had like a toothpick, maybe have one of his toothpicks or some shit, you know, some angle like that. So, I mean, a few that had come to mind, because you want like the greatest players and things that were famous about them. Obviously, like Nada's Golden Mouse. He was the first player to ever win the Golden Mouse. Remember, the Golden Mouse was effectively created so that Boxer could win it, because everyone was loving Boxer. Boxer never did it. Nada exceeded his legacy. Flash's ruler that used to measure the distance for the mouse and the fucking keyboard. That was a massive part of his game. Fatality's Tiger, even though there was that shit story where Carmack and Too Good colluded to steal it like absolute fucking cunts, and then Fatality actually lost that tournament. Like, not really a big fan of either of people's behaviour in that regard. But it was the classic mascot they had for many years. I think it was given to him by like a girlfriend or something. Cool guys to steal that, aren't they? I mean, harlots just make fun of a guy that's practicing really hard because he has a thing that's important to him. That's a talisman. If you want a Counter-Strike one, Heaton's IntelliMouse 3.0. He is basically the reason why every fucker started using that mouse. Before that, we all liked the smaller mice. We liked the ones that were like the MX300 shape from the Pilot mouse. We liked the small, the ones that had no ergonomic component. I still use them to this day. I'm even using one right now. There's fucking like the Zowie one for women or whatever, the Zowie Divina or some shit, I don't know what it's fucking called. It's a pretty good mouse though, similar shape, because basically, if people don't know, it's actually stupid that everyone just switched to that 3.0. For some people it worked. You have to realise Heaton is a giant man with enormous hands. That's why he needs a massive house like that to be able to do his claw style type grip on it or whatever the fuck. Although I guess he had it more flat over the top of the buttons. That's the kind of shit, by the way, you should go to Rambo's channel if you want to hear about. He goes into a lot of that stuff in depth. Obviously, there's a billion things we could do with that, so I'm not going to go into depth on all of them. Matrim says, with the recent MIBR news, do you think Liquid should look at picking up Taco again? If so, or if they did, do you think it would work out better or worse than the last time? Right, I'm a bit torn about that because the problem with Taco is the things he brings to the team don't tend to be based on individual form as much. So I need to know where he's at mentally, if he's motivated, and if they'd understand how to use him. Because crucially, I don't think Taco would have worked very well in Liquid if they didn't have Zeus as their coach. So since they don't have Zeus, listen, Moses likes Taco as well, but I don't know if Moses would put as much of an emphasis on how he used Taco and the role he had in that sense. So I actually do think that Taco did a lot for that team, but they also did play a different style of Counter-Strike. They did play more towards the tactical or a hybrid style between the two, as it were. So with this era of Team Liquid, I guess it depends on how much of a captain he wants to be. If he was willing to be quite forthright and ask them to put him in certain spots, then I could see it working. But if they play the style they do currently, I think it would just be lost in the mix. It'd be kind of a waste. So I'm not against it, but I also don't think it's necessary, maybe. I think they've got enough good players right now. Ask Blaster 2000. It's a question I've been asked a million times. The answer's still the same. Have you seen the Smash Brothers documentary for Super Smash Brothers Melee? If so, what is your overall opinion and specifically how they present the history and storylines of Melee? If not, what would be a documentary that you would be interested in making? Right, I've been asked that a million times. I haven't watched it. You know what? Maybe if I have the time, I'll watch it in the next few weeks. I'm obviously just locked down anyway. But I will say the way people hype it but are never able to explain what they think's brilliant about it makes it just seem like that shit where people were creaming themselves about that first fucking Dota free-to-play one. And then I watched it and I was like, you guys thought this was the best shit ever. Like, this is all right. Like, it's above average, but like everyone's too on the X Factor shit where you're all just drawn into the life stories. I care about what they do in the game, what brilliant innovations they make. So I'll watch it, but we'll see. In terms of the documentaries I'd make, there's loads. I'll give you a couple off the top of my head. I'd love to make a documentary about 2019 Fnatic League of Legends and what the problems in the team were, because you won't even believe how crazy those were. The arguments that forced people out and the miracle fucking band-aids and concepts that Youngbuck applied to make them even have chances to succeed and get top 8 at Worlds and almost beat G2. Stuff that should have been unthinkable. There's one. I think a classic one, like I say, would be go back and do something like Get Right and how he transformed into this lurking role and became a king of the game from Sweden. I think an obvious one would be something like the Na'Vi team of 2010, how they went from just being like an all-right region to being the number one team in the world because of their very interesting philosophy behind how they made the team and how Arblet told Starks he had to make it with the money. Loads of Brood War ones. I'd love to do one about like Jaedong's killer instinct and have all the people he beat and faced talking about what it's like to face him, like that Facing Ali documentary. There's loads. Nicholas Ryback says, if you, Richard Lewis, Sam, Monty and Loco created a League of Legends team today, who would play which position? How well would your team do if you time traveled back to Season 3 with all of the game's knowledge that's been accumulated over the years, wave management, team strategy, etc.? Right, Loco Doco would be AD carry for obvious reasons. It was his best role. He also had a really good mind, even though he himself would do like weird erratic moves in it sometimes. He had a really good mind for how the support and the bot lane should play in general, and very early in having the real bot lane. So I think he's actually undercredited in that sense. I made an article about how he was like the support maker. So he'd be the AD carry. I'll be the support because it's the role I play anyway, and I play aggressively and I zone non-stop for my AD carry, so I think Loco would actually fucking love playing with me. Plus, I would just boss him so he didn't do stupid shit like our dynamic on Listen Loco. Monty would be the jungler because his understanding of the map and where to go without necessarily being ahead as a jungler or having a strong champion, I think would be pretty good. He'd be able to sort of plug the holes and get people ahead. Richard should be the top laner because that is a man's role. It is about accountability. It's about knowing that you'll get fucked up like he does in his job when he's a journalist, but still prevailing anyway and being useful and battling through. And you're sometimes on an island you play by yourself. He's played his whole fucking career by himself, doesn't need help. I'll put Sam as the mid laner because a lot of people don't know this. If you ever watch any of us stream, Sam's actually not bad at CS. His skills are way better than mine. Like, he's actually a pretty legit player out of all the like streamer, fucking talent type people I've played with. Like, he has a pretty good mind for like when the go button is. And his skills aren't bad actually. I know he's played quite a lot. So I would put him as the mid laner. It's the hardest role. He's probably got the mechanics for it. So you know what? Listen, we obviously wouldn't like win tournaments, but you know, I think we would be surprisingly good. Like there's a Conor McGregor video I remember seeing. Just type in like Conor McGregor power is an illusion or something. And that video is why, if you actually had this like biff fucking knowledge in the sports almanac, you could do so much in the game. Because it's not about how hard you hit with the mechanics and all that. It's more about like execution. And if you could execute these concepts when other people don't understand them, I think for a few months you could actually get some really interesting results. Jack Varney says, is 2021 the year of Sanji Kuliev? No way. Like, I do think he's an underused player, but then I've also never seen him play outside of that very weird playing style. So I don't actually think he's that good a player, person. I think his decision making's a bit whack, so I'm not a huge fan. Pronogo says, there has been a lot of talk lately about the potential of Valve further restricting coaches in CS. Imagine that instead, Valve reconsidered their existing coaching rules and returned things to the way they were previously, with coaches able to talk at all times. Which teams are the most impacted by this change? Which coaches see their value skyrocket? Right, spoiler, the majority of good coaches would see their value skyrocket and those teams would get even better. So Zonic is obviously one, because even though his team looks capped out, imagine having two heads thinking about the game on every round, and he can watch all the monitors, whereas Glaive can only watch his own and whoever's next to him if he's dead. So I think Astralis will get even more deadly. I think Zeus from EG, just the way he can motivate people and manage like the emotional frame of the team, I think he could do amazing things with his team and make them even better. And they've already got some fucking bangers in that arsenal. Kassad, the reason why, I noticed some fuckers were trying to claim like, but Nico IGL'd his team to top 4 EliGE season 1. Yeah, with fucking Kassad behind him who could talk at all times and who could potentially micromanage fuckers like Spiddy and get next in the right spots. Like, people mad underrate that aspect of it. Put it so he had no Kassad after Kerrigan, and how did he do, my G? Exactly, with way better players. So I think Kassad could semi-shot call his teams. I think that would do a lot for Cloud9. People like Malek and Xknaz from Vitality and G2, other way around, respectively. I think they both people. Malek's shown a very good sense for how to sort of set up the structure of a team. Xknaz seems to have everyone on the right page as to what their role is. Like, I think these guys are actually probably underrated coaches because they can't do enough stuff in English. The big one. What are some of the most insane Cinderella runs in major history or in big tier 1 lands, such as Mouse Sports winning EPL Season 10 or a Vanguard making the Berlin Major Final? Of course, taking into context the teams the underdog beats. Right, the latter part is what's going to make it hard, because a lot of underdog runs, unsurprisingly, is another underdog gets an upset somewhere and then you just get to beat them. Like, if you play the second best team in the world after the first best, odds are you're not winning and not going to the finals, are you? That's just the way life works, unfortunately. So I actually would say I don't think Mouse Sports is it for me, mate, because I think they already kind of showed they were pretty sick at that CAC tournament. Sure, you wouldn't necessarily pick and beat Astralis, I'll give you that, but they were already starting to show some skills, and you saw it right afterwards, like you continued on, so I'm not even sure it was that much of a Cinderella run, really. I'm actually not even sure Cloud9 at the Boston Major should count, because the final was insane, but I actually think some of the other results, like Fnatic, they were just a good team at the time. G2, I think, should on paper have beaten them, but they did a very weird veto, and at that time they just weren't winning playoff series. Their confidence was shot. And then SK had to stand in, and even then it went to 3 maps. So I actually think that C9's was only miraculous in the final. It was only winning the final that was a fluke. That's what the C9 fans don't get. The rest of it was pretty legit. Like, they were a top 4, they were a semi-final team. That was totally fine that they could make the final, especially against a team with a stand-in. Sorry, I said Fnatic there, but it's because SK beat Fnatic. I actually think if Fnatic had beaten SK, that Fnatic would have beaten Cloud9, actually. I think they had a map pool too. I'm also not going to count Virtus.pro returning from the dead or Nip doing Nip Magic, because generally, I mean, they still had the pieces from a truly great teams. So I'm going to go with these ones instead. G2, the one with Rain and fucking Fox and stuff, them being 1 round from making the final of Cluj-Napoca is fucking bonkers. I mean, they had to beat a Mouse Sports team that were favoured to beat them, and fucking Nico was going off. They had to beat Virtus.pro when Virtus.pro was still very good. This is 2015, boys. They almost beat Envy, who were arguably, I mean, they were the number 1 ranked team in the world. Like, that's fucking insane right there. I think ENCE at last year's IEM Katowice has got to be up there. They beat Team Liquid and Na'Vi in best of 3 series. Teams that, like, no one's beaten in best of 3 series in big playoffs like that. I don't think a Vanguard qualify because of what you said at the end, like the teams they beat. Like, think about it. They beat Vitality, who, by the way, instantly kicked NBK because of an issue of what went on in that tournament. They already had, like, conflicts and were at the end of their rope. So that wasn't the best Vitality. So there were bigger issues there. They beat Renegades, who bizarrely had lost them a few times in the past and were sort of pussies in big games, unfortunately. So that's not really as crazy as you think. I know some of the best of one results were nice. Got to go with Team Liquid at Cologne 2016. They weren't even on paper supposed to get out of their group. Then they beat Na'Vi and Fnatic, 2 of the top 4 teams in the world, to go to the finals. Like, that is fucking insane. Clan Mystic winning ESWC 2013. Yes, we now know they had Apex, Kaylee, Kashim, etc. But at the time, some of those players weren't big names. That team was never supposed to beat Very Games in that final. That was going to be the Very Games era. They just won the last 2 big tournaments, including at that one beating NIP. Like, that was never supposed to happen, and they never did shit after that. They did have Heartstone from 1.6, who was something of a genius. Na'Vi winning Starladder Season 9 by the old count, so we're talking early 2014. I think off the top of my head, they beat Nip and Titan, 2 best teams in the world at the time. Like, that was bonkers, and that was Guardian. I think even Seized had like an MVP performance at that tournament. Like, that just came out of nowhere. That wasn't the Na'Vi later with all the firepower. That was like the really ropey Na'Vi still. Cloud9 making the Face It Stage 2 final. They, in the semi-finals, had to beat Fnatic, Prime Fnatic, 2-0. Do you know how few teams have ever swept that Fnatic that are called TSM? That's fucking... Even VatriSam, if they beat them, were beating them 2-1. Like, that is big-time shit. So, even though the rest of the tournament wasn't that crazy, I think they beat Na'Vi in a best-of-1. Like, that alone is fucking insane as a Cinderella run. And then they still were, like, 3 maps in the final, from what I remember. Luminosity... going to the final of Face It Stage 3, the first tournament where they had FNX and Taco, where they'd lost 16-0 to Fnatic. Then they beat Envy 3 maps. They beat Nip in 3 maps. They beat TSM in 3 maps. They beat Fnatic in 1 map and went to 3 maps with them. Like, those 4 teams would be like top 6 or 7 teams in the world. They beat 4 of them and took the other one to a 3rd map. And that Fnatic team then went on to win the next 5 events in a row. So that is one of the craziest Cinderella runs of all time. Sadly, it's what introduced the absolutely piece of shit cancer fans that then tormented our game and ruined all subsequent Twitter replies and Reddit threads. G2, when they won ECS Season 1, the one with Shocks and Scream and RPK and Body and Smiths. Like, the idea of a team was Smiths, who was absolutely washed at that point in time, and RPK hadn't gotten back to top form yet. He was just an alright player, and Body was very inexperienced. That was Shocks and Scream in fucking God mode. Arguably the best 1-2 punch of the year, even over Fall and Cold Zero for my money. They beat Nip. Nip was still a quality team. They beat Team Liquid. That was the same Nip, by the way, that had won Malmo a few months earlier. They beat Team Liquid, the same lineup with Simple standing in, who that next tournament went to the final of the major. They beat Fnatic when Olafmeister came back and 2-0'd them in the semis. The team that had been winning all those tournaments earlier in the year before his injury. And then in the final, they beat Luminosity, who later became SK Gaming, 2-0, when it was their era between their majors, to win the fucking event. What an insane run that is. Optic winning ELEAGUE Season 2, same year. They had to beat Mouse Spots, who was considered to be better than them. FaZe Clan of Carrigan. And then Astralis, who had Glaive and went on to win the next major. In context, that's fucking bonkers as well. Couple of others. More recent ones I'll do. So I'll have Team Liquid making the final of ESL New York 2017. That was where they beat Virtus.pro in a best of 3, when Virtus.pro still had some life left because of that Epicenter final. They beat Astralis when, yes, they were a bit degraded, but they were still Astralis. They beat SK Gaming in the semi-final when they had Cold Zero in god-tier form, and they were still a very good team winning tournaments. And then, yes, they got smashed by FaZe, because, spoiler, everyone got smashed by FaZe. The real what-if is what if SK had played FaZe there. That would have been a fucking cool final. The last one I'll do is actually when Vitality won Summit last year, CS Summit 4, because in the round-robin part, people forget this, they also played those, like, best of 2s, or you basically just played 2 maps, and they 2-0'd NRG, top 5-6 team in the world, 2-0 Team Liquid. By the way, it wasn't a best of 3, so it didn't count on the record, but at the time when no one was 2-0 Team Liquid, went 1-1 with ENCE, then played ENCE in the semis and beat them in like 3 maps. ENCE was one of the best teams in the world, and then 2-0 Team Liquid in the final. A team that at the time, it was insanely hard to 2-0. I mean, fucking hell, just to even vaguely get a map off was hard sometimes against those guys. Impulsive, you have done a decent amount of content on the topic of the occult. I mean, I've done like 3 or 4 videos, but fair enough. What are some good books on the topic aside from Francis Yates' work? Right, I'll give you a few off the top of my head, and I'm going to mainly do these ones on the basis of the idea you're coming in as a complete neophyte. You don't know anything about it. You're just interested in it as a topic, maybe intellectually. And I would never, by the way, recommend people get into these areas, adopt belief systems, start doing practices they don't understand. Like, you should always be responsible and you should always figure things out for yourself. Notice I didn't say just do research on the internet and believe other people. Figure things out for yourself and figure out if there's something you should be into, because there's a reason why back in the day, Israel Regardie, who was one of the great occult authors and philosophers and a former secretary of Aleister Crowley, there's a reason why he said you should have done like fucking psychotherapy, and I think he said you should have like a degree in a certain sort. He wanted you to have all this background. So the idea was you had a sense of your own bullshit, who you are, and how to sort between other bullshit, because otherwise you can get caught in some real dead ends, just like any philosophical area. And obviously in this case, not a lot of people are going to have sympathy for you, are they? So I would say some good beginner books would be like Libanol and Psychonaut by Peter J. Carroll. It's a great chaos book where he essentially, chaos magic, where he sort of takes like a deconstructionist approach to magic and just tries to show you the like underlying mechanisms without all the theatrics. By the way, it's not that the theatrics don't have a premise. I always thought Robert Anton Wilson had a good take on like the Crowley ceremonial magic, like the Christian themed aspect, which is the whole point is it was supposed to be for people from a Christian culture to scare the shit out of you and put your brain into a different reality tunnel. Like, I thought that was a pretty interesting take, but as a result, that might not be for certain people who are faint of heart for obvious reasons. Another good chaos magic book, it's a very unique one in terms of how it does it, almost applies like a shamanistic aspect, is a book called Chaos Ritual by Steve Wilson. Just again, a very unique take on it. That's unlike a lot of the other books you'll have read from that. I think a great philosophical book is by a guy I did interviews with. It's SSOTBME, like Secret Sex Rituals of the Black Magicians, or something like that, by Ramsey Dukes. It's not really like what the title says. He just knew how to do sort of like clickbait titles. It's basically about like rationalizing like science, magic, religion. Like, it's a very interesting book on philosophical grounds. Just to see how deep the subject can be and how far you can pursue these as arts and mastery. The classic is obviously Magic and Book 4 by Crowley. You're not going to be able to get much out of it when you read it. Like, you essentially have to read loads of other stuff before you'll even be able to vaguely penetrate it. But they'll just show you how deep and how not in the muck that kind of stuff can be, how it can have like a purity to it almost. I will say the book that I wish we'd had that we never had was, I wish Robert Anton Wilson had written a book on that topic. He sort of did with Prometheus Rising and Quantum psychology, kind of put his ideas in there because he obviously came more from the Korzybski school of things. But I think he could have written a really amazing book. Maybe it would have been something like the Long Milo Duquette books, but a little bit less obsessively in the Crowleyan school. I think we'll do this as like, we'll start to wind down now. We'll do the last couple and then I told you I'll do another one soon. Spoonfed89. Which 3 players from esports you follow do you feel have failed to live up to their potential? Right, obviously that's a very subjective angle, but I've got some for you here. So in CSGO, I'm going to say Phelps. I actually think he had the skills to be one of the best players, not just from Brazil, one of the best players ever. I think I still to this day wish he could just be on a good international team and speak English, and then he could accomplish a lot. Really skilled player with his own flair for the game. It's just they put him into systems and locked him down. I want to open the game up for him like he gets in those shit teams, hence why he frags out. Kirby's an obvious one. What he was doing, if you go back and watch early 2016 Dignitas, in that MSL system, where arguably you could say, in terms of historical greatness, that actually players like Config after him and AZ before were better players. But the way he played within that, MSL really opened that guy's game up, and we never really saw that afterwards. Shut the fuck up about the major. People just say that like a robot. Go back and watch it again, and you'll see that was a one-off performance, and it was mainly because Device shit the bed in the final. I think another one, an obvious one to me that everyone raves about, but actually I don't think he's come close to his potential, is Ethan from EG. His aim is clearly good. He can be quite smooth in terms of his mouse movements, but I've always felt like that guy never quite... I don't know if his role doesn't fit his mindset, but I don't think he quite knows how to use himself. I would actually like to see him in a team with less talent and him be the focal point of the team. I think that is very exciting. Like, he's a player where maybe I would buy if I had a budget team, but I can spend big on one player, I'm going to build around him and I'll get mad value out of him. For some other games, I'll do a few for each game. League of Legends, the obvious one for me is Forgiven. Now you're going to go, what do you mean? His potential was to be the best Western player ever in any role. He was already at times at his peak, as good as some of the best Asians at his role, extremely rare except for mid laners in Europe. And if he'd lived up to his potential, hadn't been a fuck up as a human being, as a personality, he would have had many championships in his cabinet. Him just having that one run to semis at Worlds, that's actually mad underperforming for what he had in his tank. Meteos is an obvious one. I think early Meteos for the first 2 or 3 years was really good, and I think if he'd have had better laners, I think he could have accomplished even. He basically should have been a TSM jungler, in my opinion. He's one of the ones that could have changed their whole fortunes. Especially if he was in like the Bjergs and Doublelift one, even though that's not quite his era. I always thought Shifter. I've always thought that guy had mad skills. Go watch his stream now. He's still a really skilled player, nice playmaker vision. Problem is he played a bit too pussy when he played in LCS, so he never really lived up to it, I'm afraid. Selfie, similarly, when he was in Super Hot Crew and in Europe, he seemed to have the skills, mate. Like, yeah, he should have been a much better player, but sadly he just kept sitting on benches, getting wrecked by every org. He just seemed to have a victim mentality for some reason. I don't know why. I'll go with a couple more. From Brood War, I'm going to pick another one like the Forgiven one. I'm going to say Bisu, and you're going to go, what the fuck are you talking? He won 4 championships. Not, he won more than that, technically, if you want to count like the GOM championships and World Cyber Games medals and IEF titles. Like, this guy, because of the race he played, couldn't have competed with Jaedong and Flash for the greatest of all time, and Nada and Alavuv and Civ. No, it's none of those are Protoss players. He's already the greatest Protoss. If Protoss hadn't have been as underpowered as it was in Brood War, I mean, he already almost was the Bonjour. He could have been the Bonjour. He could have been God. There, I said it. I think Fantasy's another classic example. Really good mind for the game. Played the right race. Had some really brilliant things. Sadly, he tended to have Flash and Jaedong run right into his motherfucking face. So, yeah, that's going to make you not enjoy the game very much. It's going to crush your spirit. Like, I thought he could have accomplished a lot more in a different era. Maybe 3 or 4 years before he would have had a bunch of championships. I think Cal, the Protoss player, love that guy's micro. He had it, at times he could be one-dimensional, but what he did, he was very good at. Like, he just ran into Jaedong way too many times. It's so unlucky. He reminds me of when Leighton Hewitt was one of the best tennis players. And there was one year in 2004 where he was really good. And in like every Grand Slam and loads of tournaments, he just kept running the Federer in like the quarterfinals of the semis. It's like, you're not going to win the tournament if that happens. So he could have had a way better career. Cal could, just as Leighton Hewitt could have. I'll give you a few from Quake Live to finish up. Evil, because again, skill set is enough to be a champion many times over. One of the most fantastically entertaining playing styles ever. Just couldn't get past Rafa and didn't play in the era where he would have had wins over Cooler and maybe the odd one over Cypher and would have got the championships. I also think he probably should have had, at times, a way to slow his game down a little bit. Strengths is an obvious one because I think he over-focused on aim. It made his dodging not as good. And you saw when smart players like Rafa took his aim and positioning away from him, he just fell on his arse, basically. A similar one, I always thought Sparty's raw aim and rail was really naughty, but he didn't really have the right mindset, it seemed, to practice really hard or be really dedicated to duel, so I think it just mindset held that guy back. Right, I'll do one more to end this one. Jake Razika says, what is your favourite what-if game or series? Obviously, I could do a million of these, boys. I'll probably do a series again like I did with some occasional ones before. Could be due to a storyline that would have been completed or because you really just wanted a team to win. Right, I've referred to one earlier. It's actually very games. Winning DreamHack Winter 2013, so Existence would have got a major, Scream would have got a major, Shocks would have got 2 majors potentially, would have changed the direction of the game. The French players wouldn't have lost faith in Existence. Maybe Existence wouldn't have lost faith in themselves. They would have had an era, probably, if you look at what they did around that time period. They even were favourites to the next major, but at that point in time, they already had some mental issues. And that could have changed the whole history of Counter-Strike. That tactical style could have been dominant at that period of time when everyone thought it was about the loose style. In line with the Bisu comment before, the one that always sticks out to me is if Bisu had beaten Fantasy and made it to the Batu OSL final. Because that's the one where Fantasy was his teammate, and he could beat Fantasy any other day. But that day, Fantasy just 3-0'd him. I think maybe he had like some sort of read on his builds or something. And if Bisu had made the final, we would have had the Jaedong versus Bisu best of 5 grand final that we always wanted. And we got like a shit version of, because the 5th game didn't live up to it, in that GOM Classic like special match or whatever the fuck it was, where the other games were straight fire and then the 5th game was ruined by like a Plob, not Brock and fucking the Zergling or whatever. So, to me, Bisu was the player who had the style and the race match. I mean, obviously, Jaedong was a god-tier EVP player as well, where he could have made that a really sick final against Jaedong, but we just never got that final. The last one, I'll pick a match that I just want to overturn the result of, which is, I think, the championship Cooler should have had, that would have been a world championship, was QuakeCon 2010. He was playing an unbelievable final against Cypher, but Cypher just did miracle shit, famously on Aero Walk, just impossible shit that no one else could do. He barely himself did it and somehow won. But I think if Cooler had won that, it would have been more satisfying. The other one he could have won that could have changed things and made it a little bit more spicy is the IEM4 Global Final the same year against Rafa. He had two of the hardest losses I've ever seen, where a player who lost played better than some other people played in finals they won. So, okay, I'm going to do another one of these pretty quick to get through the rest of the questions. So, if you've seen this video now, description box, there'll be a link to the next set of questions to be gathered. And also, I'll be taking some from my Patreon AMA channel, which if you have your Discord account attached to your Patreon and you are someone who is in that category, you can go and access that channel on my Discord. Also, I've got a clips channel and I've got some other shit coming up soon you might be into. This video was kindly supported by Pronogo, Mohammed, Alabdul, Razzaq, Dean Tanglis, James Pederson, VatriSam, ErikHillestad, Andreas Kroknes, Hades, Zoomba Gaming, JDubs, Tobias Bernasconi, and Alexander Rao. Special thanks, as always, goes out to Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for one of my upcoming episodes? Maybe you want to ask more of those questions in that video AMA I do each month. Do you want teasers? Find out who the next guests are for my shows. Well, maybe you even want to take part in one of those crazy donated discussions where we go all over the place. If any of these perks appeal to you, or you want to support the channel, put your money where your mouth is and join the Skrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.